Imagine a boss so confused by reality they once filed a complaint against gravity. That's the level we're dealing with here. Executives waging war on basic facts and losing. And trust me, that wasn't even the warm-up for what comes next. 1. A regional manager once filed an official complaint because an employee sneezed too confidently. According to this self-appointed sneeze critic, the sound carried an undertone of defiance and suggested the employee might be harboring rebellious ambitions like wanting a lunch break that lasts longer than 7 minutes. The manager insisted sneezes should be subtle, apologetic, and quiet enough to not imply personality. They even proposed a sneeze training module, complete with sample recordings of acceptable nasal restraint. Meanwhile, everyone else was trying to figure out how a man in charge of millions of dollars worth of operations could be emotionally destabilized by airborne droplets. The employee was told to consider how their bodily expulsions affect workplace morale, proving once again that some people climb the corporate ladder not because they're competent, but because gravity occasionally fails. 2. A boss once lodged a furious complaint after noticing an employee walking slightly faster than him in the hallway. Not running, not jogging, just walking at a pace that suggested purpose. The boss interpreted this as an attempt to establish hallway dominance and undermine his authority by reaching the printer first. He demanded HR issue a memo reminding staff that managers set the tone for office speed and that any employee walking with excessive purpose, urgency, or rhythm could face disciplinary action. Apparently, productivity wasn't the goal. Maintaining the illusion that he was the busiest organism on Earth was. The employee was genuinely confused to learn that stepping too enthusiastically toward a stapler could be considered an act of corporate rebellion. Meanwhile, the boss strutted around at a snail's pace like a monarch whose crown was dangerously unstable, determined to show the office who controlled the velocity of morale. 3. A director once complained that an employee's water bottle was too emotionally distracting. It wasn't playing music, glowing, or leaking. It was simply stainless steel. According to this brilliant observer of human psychology, the water bottle's metallic finish reflected too much light and created an assertive presence on the desk that overshadowed managerial authority. The director demanded the employee replace it with something quieter and humbler, ideally a muted, plain vessel that conveyed respect for the corporate hierarchy. When someone suggested the director simply move their eyes 2 inches to the left, the suggestion was dismissed as insubordinate. The employee reluctantly switched bottles, while the director celebrated this victory like they'd prevented a hostile takeover instead of just bullying a canteen. Somewhere in the universe, a therapist felt a sudden chill without knowing why. 4. One boss filed a formal complaint because an employee's keyboard sounded too productive. The clicking apparently created an atmosphere that implied activity exceeding managerial expectations, which made the boss uncomfortable because it highlighted the fact that the employee was doing work at a normal human rate, while the boss was Googling leadership quotes that make you look deep. The complaint claimed the keyboard was a sonic assertion of ambition and recommended the employee switch to a soft, mushy keyboard that sounded like a lethargic marshmallow giving up. The employee, who genuinely didn't know keyboards were capable of psychological warfare, had to attend a meeting about sound discipline. Meanwhile, the boss wandered the office seeking evidence of other productivity crimes, like stapling too efficiently or breathing with intent. 5. A manager became enraged after seeing an employee eat a sandwich that looked too gourmet. It wasn't caviar or truffle foam, it was a turkey sandwich with spinach. But the manager felt personally attacked, claiming the sandwich was flaunting an elevated lifestyle inconsistent with workplace humility. They complained about sandwich elitism and suggested that lunch choices should reflect relatable energy, like ham on white bread. The employee was advised to choose meals less likely to create class division, because apparently leafy greens are now symbols of insubordination. The manager continued eating microwaved noodles every day, convinced the office was one lunch choice away from a socio-economic uprising. 6. A boss once scolded an employee because their desktop wallpaper, a stock photo of mountains, was too ambitious. Yes, apparently geology can threaten a manager's sense of authority. The boss claimed the mountains represented overly aspirational metaphors and implied the employee might have goals beyond the company, like joy or upward mobility. They ordered the wallpaper replaced with something neutral and grounding, like beige, actual beige. When IT hesitated, the boss asked if they understood the psychological impact of unregulated landscapes. Meanwhile, the employee wondered how anyone could feel overshadowed by a JPEG of Colorado. 7. A senior manager once filed a complaint claiming an employee's email signature was too confident because it included a period at the end of their job title. Not an exclamation point, not a manifesto, just punctuation. The manager insisted the period conveyed finality, assertiveness, and emotional decisiveness incompatible with junior staff. They recommended the signature be softened by removing punctuation entirely or substituting it with a friendly emoji. HR declined the emoji idea after experiencing a full-body shudder. The employee removed the period, while the manager strutted around with the victorious pride of someone who had successfully defeated grammar. 8. A boss once lost their composure because an employee used a mug from a competitor's conference, even though the mug was free, generic, and statistically owned by half the planet. The boss interpreted this beverage-related betrayal as brand disloyalty and potential treason. They demanded the employee switch to a company-branded mug because nothing says loyalty like drinking lukewarm coffee out of merchandise designed by an intern. The employee explained that it was the only clean mug they had that morning, but the boss insisted the issue was symbolic. Meanwhile, nobody addressed the symbolic meaning of a grown adult policing ceramic cups like a Cold War intelligence officer. 9. A department head complained because an employee wore a coat indoors during winter. The office was freezing due to a broken thermostat, but the boss insisted the coat suggested emotional withdrawal from the collaborative spirit. They argued that dressing warm created barriers to open communication, because apparently fleece vests are now classified as forms of quiet quitting. When someone pointed out that the temperature was roughly equivalent to a refrigerated warehouse, the boss recommended employees warm themselves through teamwork. The coat remained, but the boss left with the satisfaction of someone who had just defended the company from thermal disloyalty. 10. A manager once demanded HR intervene because an employee laughed at a joke too freely. The laughter wasn't directed at anyone. It wasn't disruptive. The problem, according to this emotional hall monitor, was that the laugh sounded too relaxed, which suggested the employee felt comfortable at work, an unforgivable sin in certain corporate ecosystems. The manager insisted that workplace laughter should be controlled, polite, and restrained, ideally resembling the sound of someone nodding through a mandatory compliance seminar. HR declined to regulate human joy, which surprised everyone, including HR. The manager left muttering about maintaining professional emotional tones, unaware that they sounded like a villain from a dystopian children's book. 11. A boss filed a complaint because an employee's desk plant was too lively. The plant wasn't oversized, invasive, or carnivorous. It was just visibly alive. The boss worried the plant set unrealistic expectations for environmental enthusiasm and could encourage other employees to bring in unregulated foliage. They feared the office would devolve into a botanical free-for-all, as if ferns were plotting a coup. They insisted the plant either be removed or replaced with a less expressive succulent. The employee complied, while their co-workers quietly admired the rare example of someone losing a power struggle with photosynthesis. 12. A supervisor once reprimanded an employee for typing an email too quickly. Not rudely, just at a normal, competent pace. The boss claimed fast typing creates the illusion of high efficiency, which may pressure others to perform at unrealistic speeds. In other words, being good at your job was affecting the delicate ecosystem of mediocrity. The supervisor recommended the employee slow their communication style to a more approachable rhythm, as if email were jazz and the boss was threatened by someone else's tempo. The employee slowed down just enough to avoid further scrutiny, while the supervisor wandered off to protect the office from dangerous displays of competence. 13. A manager once insisted an employee stop organizing their desk so neatly because it implied passive judgment of colleagues with messy workspaces. The boss claimed the clean desk introduced hierarchical energy and made others feel structurally inferior. They demanded the employee scatter a few papers around for balance. When asked if disorganization was now a performance expectation, the boss replied that visual diversity creates workplace harmony, proving once again that nothing confuses a certain kind of manager more than the idea of someone being tidy on purpose. The employee reluctantly added some aesthetic clutter, while the boss felt victorious for protecting workplace morale from the tyrannical forces of organization. 14. A department director once complained that an employee's handwriting on a shared whiteboard looked too authoritative. It wasn't bold, artistic, or calligraphic, just legible. But the director felt the neat handwriting created a narrative of dominance, which could discourage others from contributing. They insisted the employee either write messier or let someone else handle notes, ideally someone with friendlier handwriting energy. The employee, confused about how penmanship had become a political issue, agreed to step back. The director celebrated the win like they'd solved a corporate crisis instead of just losing an argument to letters of the alphabet. 15. A supervisor once demanded HR discipline an employee for wearing too calm a facial expression. According to this connoisseur of emotional micromanagement, the employee's neutral face suggested insufficient urgency and passive resistance to the company's dynamic pace. When someone pointed out that the employee was literally just existing, the supervisor doubled down, claiming that facial energy directly impacts productivity. They recommended the employee adopt a more engaged expression, possibly by lifting the eyebrows more, to show enthusiasm for spreadsheets. The employee complied just enough to avoid being pulled into another discussion about eyebrow ethics, while the supervisor strutted away convinced they had successfully shaped workplace culture through the power of unsolicited facial analysis. 16. A mid-level manager once issued a formal complaint because an employee's swivel chair rotated too freely, which the manager interpreted as a sign of uncontained workplace energy. The chair wasn't motorized, noisy, or possessed by the spirit of a hyperactive raccoon. It simply turned the way chairs are designed to turn. But the manager insisted the rotation suggested excessive comfort and could lead to unpredictable decision-making. They claimed a stable workforce required stable furniture, preferably chairs that rotated no more than 15 degrees in either direction, like the emotional range of certain executives. When asked if restricting chair movement might hinder productivity, the manager replied that productivity was secondary to tonal consistency, which is corporate speak for, "I don't care if work gets done as long as nothing in my field of vision spins too enthusiastically." The employee accepted a slightly stiffer chair, while everyone quietly wondered how a grown adult lost a power struggle to office furniture. 17. One supervisor once complained that an employee's calendar reminders were too cheerful. The reminders weren't inspirational quotes or dancing gifs, just little pop-ups that said things like "meeting in 10 minutes" with a basic exclamation point. But the supervisor claimed the punctuation created an overly festive tone that distracts from the seriousness of business obligations. They recommended the employee remove all exclamation points to maintain a sense of corporate gravity, because nothing terrifies certain managers more than the notion that someone might face the day with mild optimism. When IT confirmed that calendar punctuation was, in fact, editable, the supervisor acted like they'd uncovered a loophole in federal law. Meanwhile, the employee adjusted the reminders to be so emotionally flat they could double as default AI text, proving that in certain workplaces, even digital notifications are expected to demonstrate quiet resignation. 18. A boss once complained that an employee's lunch container was too organized, which allegedly projected an image of personal stability unmatched by management. The container had neat compartments, veggies here, protein there, a reasonable adult lunch setup. But to the boss, the tidy layout suggested the employee might possess qualities like foresight and planning, which created imbalanced workplace optics. They suggested the employee choose a more relatable style of lunching, ideally a chaotic assortment of crumpled wrappers and leftover spaghetti stuffed into a flimsy plastic tub. When the employee laughed, the boss doubled down, warning that excessively structured meals can intimidate peers. Somehow, this was said with a straight face. The employee eventually switched to a different lunchbox to avoid further scrutiny, while the boss celebrated a victory as if they defended corporate culture from the threat of well-portioned broccoli. 19. A senior manager once reported that an employee's umbrella was too assertive. The umbrella wasn't enormous, neon, or a promotional item for a rival corporation. It was just a normal umbrella that opened reliably in the rain. But the manager insisted its snapping action conveyed an abruptness incompatible with the company's gentle communication style. They argued the umbrella should open more politely, ideally in a way that expressed cooperative intent. The employee was told to open it slowly to avoid projecting aggressive energy, as if rain protection was now part of workplace emotional calibration. The employee complied for exactly one rainy day before reverting to normal umbrella physics, while the manager stood under the awning scowling at precipitation like it was staging a coup. 20. A director once made HR intervene because an employee took notes in a meeting too diligently. The director claimed the act of writing quickly suggested the employee was preparing strategic counterpoints, which made them feel intellectually cornered. The notes, by the way, were about quarterly numbers, not a manifesto for overthrowing middle management. But the director argued that intense note-taking created a power imbalance and requested a policy limiting pen speed to something more collaborative. The employee had to practice a slower, softer scribble, the kind usually reserved for shopping lists and bad poetry. Meanwhile, the director strutted around like they had successfully dismantled a rival faction instead of just policing penmanship. 21. A manager filed a complaint because an employee arrived to work with a slightly wet coat on a rainy day, claiming the moisture introduced a damp, emotional tone into the office. They insisted the coat be dried outside before entry, as if humidity was a form of workplace sabotage. When someone gently pointed out that water falls from the sky and coats absorb it, the manager replied that professionalism requires climate adaptation. The employee ended up hanging the coat in a distant corner like it was being punished for existing, while the manager continued lecturing about maintaining environmental discipline, a phrase that made everyone picture them attempting to scold a thunderstorm. 22. A supervisor once took issue with an employee using too many tabs on their browser, claiming the display of open tabs projected reckless enthusiasm for multitasking. The employee had 9 tabs, barely a warm-up for the average human, but the supervisor insisted that more than 5 created a chaotic digital landscape detrimental to workplace serenity. They recommended the employee adopt the one task, one tab philosophy, which is the digital equivalent of giving someone a calculator and forbidding them from pressing more than one button per minute. The employee complied for a week before realizing the system slowed them to prehistoric speeds, while the supervisor walked around feeling victorious for having briefly defeated modern technology. 23. A manager once scolded an employee for drinking water too often, claiming excessive hydration created an impression of idleness because the employee was always reaching for the bottle. When someone mentioned that drinking water is literally how human bodies remain functional, the manager clarified they weren't opposed to hydration, just hydration performed with such visible regularity. They encouraged the employee to drink more discreetly, as if water consumption were a questionable hobby. The employee eventually moved their water bottle slightly out of view to avoid further discussion, while the manager continued their crusade against the dangerous spectacle of people staying alive. 24. A leader in a large company once reported that an employee's backpack looked too adventurous, implying the employee might secretly be the kind of person who enjoys weekends. The backpack was perfectly ordinary, black, durable, unremarkable. But the leader insisted it conveyed non-corporate aspirations and encouraged the employee to consider a more traditional carrying instrument, which apparently meant a briefcase that looked like it carried either divorce documents or expired coupons. The employee politely ignored the suggestion, while the leader wandered off, convinced that stopping a rugged-looking backpack was a crucial step in safeguarding organizational loyalty. 25. A supervisor once reprimanded an employee for highlighting text too assertively. The highlighter color was standard yellow, not radioactive neon or glow-in-the-dark pink. Yet the supervisor insisted the brightness created visual tension and implied the employee had strong opinions about workflow. They recommended switching to pastel tones that promote emotional gentleness, because apparently the future of corporate cooperation hinges on highlight opacity. The employee downgraded to a dull peach color that barely showed up, while the supervisor strutted around like they had successfully negotiated peace in a fluorescent civil war. 26. A boss once filed a complaint because an employee's phone notification sound was too optimistic. The sound was the standard default chime, but the boss felt it carried excessive upward emotional motion, whatever that means. They argued the cheerful tone placed unrealistic emotional expectations on the workspace. When IT offered to help the employee choose a different sound, the boss suggested something emotionally neutral, like a single dull thud. The employee switched to a tone so flat it felt like listening to a tax form being printed. Meanwhile, the boss congratulated themselves for rescuing the workplace from the tyranny of pleasant noises. 27. A manager once reported an employee to HR because their shoes were too quiet. Yes, too quiet. The manager insisted that silent footwear allowed the employee to move unpredictably, creating stealth dynamics inappropriate for professional settings. They suggested the employee choose more audible shoes, ideally ones that made a mild tapping sound to signal approach. In other words, they wanted human turn signals. The employee, who was not a ninja and had no interest in sneaking up on anyone, reluctantly switched to slightly louder shoes. Meanwhile, the manager walked around feeling like they had successfully restored acoustic transparency, unaware that the rest of the office now referred to them as the footstep sheriff. 28. A senior director once became deeply unsettled because an employee's handwriting in a shared notebook was too round. They claimed the round letters conveyed excessive whimsy for a data-driven environment and could undermine the seriousness of corporate initiatives. They recommended switching to more angular, decisive handwriting, which is somehow the first time anyone has attempted to micromanage geometry. The employee complied with a half-hearted attempt at pointier letters, while colleagues quietly marveled at the director's ability to find emotional symbolism in the shape of the letter O29. A manager once insisted an employee stop using metal cutlery because the clinking sound introduced an unproductive culinary sharpness. They recommended the employee switch to wooden or plastic cutlery to preserve acoustic harmony. When someone pointed out that the break room wasn't a meditation studio, the manager doubled down, arguing that the metallic sound could provoke subconscious aggression. The employee switched to quiet, unimpressive plastic utensils, while the manager walked away feeling like they had prevented an international incident instead of just banning spoons with dignity. 30. One supervisor complained that an employee's PowerPoint transitions were too smooth, suggesting the employee was performing with a level of showmanship inconsistent with their pay grade. The transitions were basic fades, nothing Vegas-level flashy, but the supervisor argued the seamless slides created a theatrically polished atmosphere that made upper management look less prepared by comparison. They suggested switching to more humble transitions, like abrupt cuts, because nothing says corporate modesty like a slideshow that feels like a car with failing brakes. The employee complied, while the supervisor proudly believed they had prevented a hostile presentation takeover. 31. A director once filed a complaint because an employee's signature looked too mature, claiming the flowing cursive suggested the employee possessed a level of personal authority that could confuse hierarchical boundaries. The outer signature wasn't ornate or artistic, it was just adult handwriting, something the director apparently considered a threat. They recommended the employee switch to block letters to maintain appropriate emotional distance from leadership. When the employee asked if signatures were now part of the chain of command, the director responded with absolute sincerity, "Consistency of symbolism is crucial." The employee changed nothing, of course, while the director left believing they had narrowly prevented an uprising led by ink and penmanship. And that's the tour. Proof some bosses shouldn't supervise a houseplant. Drop your favorite disaster in the comments, vote for the dumbest, and yeah, hit the buttons if you want more chaos.